On Canada's east coast, the Atlantic isn't the only thing that's dark and restless. It Came from the Maritimes is co-hosted by siblings Evan and Chelsea, who share the region's fog-shrouded legends, haunted lighthouses, ghost ships, and chilling folklore passed down through generations. It's maritime history at its most haunting. True crime, eerie local lore, and the mysteries that refuse to stay buried. For those drawn to the strange and storied side of the East Coast, It Came from the Maritimes releases new episodes every week. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
Research and recording of Canadian Creepies happens on the shared land and traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, many of whom continue to live and work here today. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. A key treaty governing this territory is the Dish with One Spoon Agreement. This treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee people binds them to share and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, settlers, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. We all share the responsibility of ensuring the dish is never empty, meaning we must take care of the land and the creatures we share it with.
Welcome, wanderers, to Journey Down the Crooked Path, a place where the stories are stranger, the shadows stretch longer, and the things that go bump in the night might just be listening. I'm Amanda Joy, your guide into the eerie, the forgotten, and the downright bizarre. Here, we step off the well-lit roads of Canadian creepies and venture into the murky corners of history, folklore, and the unexplained, where the whispers grow louder and the truth is never quite what it seems. So let's take a deep breath, watch your step, and whatever you do, don't look back. Once you start down the crooked path, you never know what might follow.
Here on the Tuesday segment of Canadian Creepies, I've talked about the Nahanni Valley before, and it's a pretty creepy one. Here's a quick recap for the sake of this episode, but I do encourage you to go back and have a listen. The story of the Nahanni Valley, or should I say, the Valley of the Headless Men, opens up with Albert and Willie McLeod heading into the Nahanni Valley in 1908 during the gold rush. They set up camp near the river, and the last people to see them were a pair of trappers who passed through that summer. Now, the brothers are missing, so when a search party goes in to find them, they find that the brothers' camp is still standing. The campground was basically how the brothers had left it when whatever happened. There was even the remains of a meal in the fire pit. Both of the brothers were found deceased, and both of them were missing their heads. A partner who had gone prospecting with them during this trip vanished entirely. Later, in 1927, Martin Jorgensen arrived in the valley and built a cabin near Flat River. Several prospectors in the area saw him that summer, including Frank Henderson and Peter Carver. Both mentioned that he had been working on a small claim. In November of 1927, a group of men traveling through the valley saw smoke rising from the direction of his cabin. When they reached the site, the cabin had already collapsed. They found Jorgensen's remains close by. He was also missing his head. In 1947, John Peterson went into the valley with a pack horse and enough supplies for several weeks. The last person to speak with him was a trader named Samuel Carter, who saw him near Fort Simpson before he set out. Months later, a group of hunters found Peterson's camp equipment along the riverbank. The gear was intact, and the horse pack was found grazing nearby. Peterson himself was never found. These are just a few of the many stories of gruesome deaths and disappearances that have happened throughout the Nahanni Valley over the decades. Historical accounts and modern reporting consistently describe many deaths and disappearances in the valley, but no official consolidated total exists. However, multiple sources confirm that the region has accumulated numerous fatalities over the decades, enough to inspire the place names like Deadman Valley, Headless Creek, and Funeral Range. And if you move past the Prospectors, the Nahanni Valley is filled with all sorts of weird, supernatural stories and events. Pilots during the 1940s reported lights moving across the sky. Robert Nicholson described a bright sapphire drifting above the tree line during a supply run. In 1953, Helen Ward reported a similar event near the bend east of Sunblood Mountain. Hunters in Raymond Bonnet's group were moving along the river in July of 1972 when the air temperature jumped hard enough that everyone reacted at once. Bonnet stopped first. Marcel Gros, Peter Loon, and Henry Paul all followed him. They all turned towards a low run of dark rock on the east bank. Bonnet said that the rest of the heat hit him across the face. Marcel said it hit him in the chest, and Paul said that it felt like he stepped in front of a stove. They all stood there until the air cooled again. Families who lived along the river had their own lore and stories. In August of 1962, Mary Blackwater was walking the ridge just above the South Bend when she saw a tall figure moving along the edge. She later walked her brother Daniel to the same spot and showed him the exact line where this figure had crossed. That same month, Joseph Segues was above the narrow pass west of the river. He saw a figure moving between two boulders. He marked the distance by the spruce at the bend and the notch in the cliff. He said that the figure cleared the gap in just 3 steps. Aside from its gruesome reputation of death and headless men, there is another rumor that is repeated through the Nahanni Valley. The people in the region have passed the story around for generations, keeping it right beside those reports of disappearances and strange lights. Rumors claim that somewhere in that stretch of wilderness, maybe near one of the tributaries feeding into the South Nahanni River, there is a warm pocket of land where the snow never settles and the ground stays soft, even in the coldest of months. The story connects to a wider set of northern accounts that reach across the Canadian Arctic and point all the way back to events that reshaped the region in a very real way. On July 14, 1897, the Excelsior rolled into the San Francisco harbor looking like it had been patched together more than once. Dock workers barely glanced at it until passengers started filing out. The group that stepped out onto the pier looked like they had been living off of bannock, bad coffee, and pure stubbornness. Their shirts were worn thin, their hats had lost whatever shape they once held onto. The men had beards that looked like they'd grown simply out of spite, and the women had hair that had clearly been given up on. The real commotion, however, started when these people began unloading their gear. Suitcases hit the plank with a thud that made people turn their heads, but there was a small group from the Excelsior that headed straight to the Selby Smelting Works on Montgomery Street. They walked in, set their containers on the counter, and opened them right in front of everyone. Inside sat piles of raw gold pulled straight out of the northern ground. And with that, word shot through the city that a massive gold strike had been made in a remote part of the northern West Canada called the Klondike. The reaction was instant. People from every background dropped what they were doing and started planning their own escape north. Newspapers gave the frenzy a nickname, and the streets filled with people repeating the same promise to themselves: reach the Klondike or regret it forever. The gold rush of 1898 brought a flood of travelers headed towards Dawson City. Some of them bought steamboat tickets in San Francisco or Seattle and rode the Pacific coast to the Lynn Canal in Alaska. From there, they hauled their gear over the coast mountains by the Chilkoot Trails or White Pass, built their own canoes on the far side, and paddled through the channel of lakes and rivers towards the gold fields. Those with deeper pockets stayed on steamers all the way to St. Michael, Alaska, before traveling up the Yukon River to Dawson. A few Americans tried to dodge Canadian customs by taking the all-American route, which meant crossing the Valdez and the Malaspina glaciers on foot. Some prospectors tried the Ashcroft Trail on horseback, pushing through the grasslands of the Caribou Plateau, the dense forests of the Great Bear Rainforest, and the mosquito-heavy swamps of northern British Columbia. Others followed Edmonton Journal's encouragement and attempted the all-Canadian route from Edmonton, Alberta. A handful of those travelers veered into the Nahanni Valley, hoping the South Nahanni River would carry them forward to the Klondike faster than the established paths. More than 100,000 people set out for the Klondike during the rush, and only a fraction of those reached Dawson City, and even smaller number actually searched for gold once they arrived. Those who actually searched for gold spent the final years of the 19th century and the early years of the 20th century panning the creeks of South Dakota. When they spotted those promising flashy colors in their pans, they staked claims on the spot. Winters in the Klondike, though, turned every prospector into a completely different creature. They went from prospectors to miners. Once the claims were staked, the pans got tossed aside and everybody grabbed pickaxes like they were auditioning for the world's coldest construction crew. Now, the ground here was frozen solid, so they built these enormous fires right over the spots that they planned to dig. Those fires burned all night, fed continuously by whoever drew the short straw. By morning, the flames died down enough for them to shovel through the ash and scrape at the thawed layer underneath. Every chunk of dirt they pulled up went into a growing pile beside the shaft, and those piles got big fast. When spring finally showed up, the whole operation shifted again. The miners shoveled their pay dirt into these long wooden troughs called sluice boxes. These things were set on a slant and ribbed on the inside and looked like someone had built a homemade water slide for gravel. Water would get poured in at the top and the flow carried everything downward. The heavier gold settled into the ribs. The lighter stuff washed away. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked well enough to keep everyone hopeful. Out of the about 20,000 people who tried their luck this way, only 4,000 found anything worth bragging about. And from that group, only a few hundred walked away with the kind of haul that changes lives. The rest packed up their gear and headed home with stories instead of riches. But there were a few who still refused to give up and kept chasing that next rumor, that next rush. A few headed west towards Norm, where another rush was already underway. Others took dog sleds or canoes to the quieter corners of the subarctic, returning with stories that made listeners raise their eyebrows and lean in closer. By the early 1900s, the men drifting back from the northern brush weren't just bringing back sore muscles and empty pockets. They came home with stories that spread faster than a bar tab in a mining town. Every saloon, trading post, Mountie Station, and Mission House had at least one prospector holding court, swearing up and down that the wilderness had shown them things that no one was prepared for. Some claimed that they'd seen lights drifting through the trees with no lantern or campfire to explain them. Others insisted they'd stumbled onto old digs that no one could trace a claim to. A few swore up and down that they crossed paths with an animal that had no business being alive in that century. And then there were the men who'd lean in close and say that they'd met something on two legs that definitely wasn't human. Mixed in with all that was a rumor that always made people stop. According to the prospectors who swore that they had seen it, there was a warm valley tucked somewhere deep in the northern wilds. They would describe it as a place that the air always felt heavy and the ground stayed warm even in the dead of winter. Remember, this is a place where it's cold and winter almost 90% of the time. But people said that they had been in this area with thick greenery, animals everywhere, and a heat that didn't make sense for the region. Depending on who was telling the story, the warmth came from a spring under the ground or some kind of volcanic activity hidden beneath the rock. Every version, though, had the same core claim, a pocket of land that was kind of patchworked into the north. Now, of course, this rumor didn't stay local for long. By the 1920s, newspapers started picking it up, and one of the first was the Valdez Miner out of Alaska, which ran a piece in 1922 about two prospectors named Hank Russell and Jack Lee. The article claimed that the pair were climbing a snowy mountain pass when they spotted a green valley far below, partially hidden by mist, and they decided to check it out. According to the story, Russell and Lee were bundled in heavy parkas, and they still felt overheated the moment they stepped into the valley. Some spots were so warm that the heat pushed right through the soles of their moccasins. They noticed geysers shooting up nearby and vents that released steady clouds of steam. They even cooked their food over one of these vents. The valley was also packed with wildlife. Caribou grazed in the tall grass and barely even noticed the two men. Birds filled the trees, and the lake in the middle of the valley was crowded with geese and ducks. Bears wandered to the edge, moving through patches of bright wildflowers.
You. Yeah, you. Still haunting the same old fast fashion? Time to dig up something better with Back from the Dead Goods, a Canadian small business where forgotten threads get a second life and sustainability meets spooky. This isn't just upcycled clothing, it's resurrected fashion with an eerie edge. Handpicked, reworked, and revived, every piece is as unique as a ghost story whispered at midnight. And because you're a part of the Canadian Creepies family, you get an exclusive deal. Use code Canadian Creepies at checkout for 10% off. Find them lurking on Instagram, Etsy, and Poshmark. Links are in the episode description. Give your wardrobe a second chance at life, if you dare. Looking for your next obsession? The Creators Collective Podcasts is your gateway to the dark, the chilling, and the downright fascinating. We're a community of independent podcasts with one goal: to share the best in true crime, paranormal tales, folklore, and unexplained mysteries. Whether you crave cold cases that won't stay closed, haunted histories that refuse to be forgotten, or stories that make you sleep with the lights on, there's a show waiting for you in the collective. And when you join us, you're not just listening to one podcast, you're stepping into a world of creators who love this stuff as much as you do. Check out the Creators Collective today. Follow the link in our show notes to discover your next favorite podcast. We'll be waiting for you. Let's take a moment during this break to talk about something that matters. Something that doesn't get to be background noise. The Anishinaabe-Moan word, Nikinagana, means we are all related, and we are. But relationship isn't just about words, it's about responsibility. Canadian author Naomi Klein once said, "It is not enough to say that we live on Indigenous land. We have to act as if we do." And one way to do that is by supporting Pay Your Rent, a grassroots mutual aid initiative that offers direct material support to Indigenous organizers across this land. It's not charity, it's rent. For those of us who aren't Indigenous to this place, it's a way to show up differently, to redistribute some of what's been taken. The Pay Your Rent Fund started as a one-time request for help in 2018 and grew into a nonprofit called Nikinagana. Your monthly or one-time donation can help provide food, hygiene supplies, housing support, and resources for Indigenous-led resistance and community care. So if you've ever said, "We're all related," ask yourself, are you being a good relative? Visit payyourrent.ca and find out more about how you can be part of something better. Now, back to this case.
Now, so far, this all sounds really delightful, but there was one detail that was a little peculiar. Around the lake, Russell and Lee said that they found these huge round tracks. Each one was about 18 inches across with 3 deep impressions in the front. The article hinted that if the men had lived in a different era, they might have blamed the tracks on something prehistoric. And this wasn't the only newspaper to run an article about this warm northern valley. There was one out of Seattle, the Alaska Weekly, and it ran a piece in July of 1924 that leaned hard into the story. This particular article featured a man named Captain Samuel C. Scotty, who claimed to have spent not one, but 2 winters tucked inside of a warm pocket somewhere in the Cassiar Mountains of northern British Columbia. And he made it sound like he had found the Norse best-kept secret. Scotty described a valley that you could reach by following the Steichen River or heading into Telegraph Creek. He gave measurements like he was reading off of a property listing, about 20 miles long, a few miles wide, swampy in places, dotted with small lakes, and full of flat stretches covered in timber. He said that the soil was dark and rich enough to grow vegetables without much effort. He attributed the warmth on hot springs tucked into the foothills. According to him, those springs stayed warm all winter and then turned ice cold in the summer, which only made the whole thing sound stranger. After Scotty finished describing them, the article's writer tossed in his own idea, suggesting that the valley might feel warm simply because it sat far lower than the surrounding terrain. One detail of Scotty's story that helped the rumor spread faster was Scotty mentioning the animals that he had seen wandering around in the place, including a pale deer that he couldn't identify. I mean, what gets people talking faster than a mystery creature in a spot that nobody can find on a map? By June 1925, the Alaska Weekly decided to go big with a story from a Vancouver mining engineer named Frank Perry. According to the article, Perry had spent nearly 2 decades wandering the northern backcountry, with only 2 pack dogs and an unattainable level of confidence. He claimed that he had found a hidden valley while crossing a lonely mountain pass, somewhere around Fort Nelson. Perry said he was mushing over a ridge when he spotted a thick blanket of fog sitting in a valley below. When he got closer, he realized the mist wasn't weather at all. Hot water was running through the place in a wide stream, fed by springs scattered everywhere. The steam hit the cold air and built a fog so dense that he had to slow down just to see where he was stepping. He described a place that had a tropical-like heat. Snow didn't stick, ice didn't form, and the plants grew like they were trying to outdo each other. He talked about vines stretching far above his head, ferns tall enough to hide behind, and trees thick enough that he had to circle around them. He even mentioned rose bushes with stems so big that he had to push them aside with both hands. The whole place sounded like it had been dropped into the mountains by total accident, or something out of the late Jurassic period. And the animals? They didn't seem bothered by any of this. Perry said that the valley was full of sheep, goats, caribou, and moose, all of them looking unusually well fed. He described the moose and the caribou as being so round that they reminded him of old illustrations of war horses. And the bears, they just walked through the place like they owned it. Again, this all sounds really rather beautiful. But then Perry goes on to say that the local Indigenous families refuse to go near the valley. They warned him about an enormous 3-toed tracks pressed into the rocks around the lake. Prints were wide and perfectly shaped, and nothing like the tracks of any animal that he recognized. This lines up with the strange footprints that other prospectors had mentioned. And of course, Perry didn't stop there. He claimed the valley wasn't just warm and full of wildlife. He said the ground held thick veins of gold, silver, and copper, along with coal and iron deposits big enough to keep miners busy for years. This was the kind of detail that made listeners raise their eyebrows and wonder how much of his story he expected people to believe. I mean, it all sounds pretty wonderful, like too good to be true wonderful. A few months after Frank Perry's story hit the newspapers, another Alaskan outlet decided it had its own piece of Warm Valley drama to share. The Wrangler Sentinel ran on September 1925, an article claiming that a Royal Canadian Air Force colonel named J. Scott Williams had flown over British Columbia on an early prospecting mission and spotted something that didn't belong in the northern mountains. According to the paper, he said that he had found a valley full of hot springs, thick greenery, and plants growing like they had no idea that they were supposed to be in a subarctic climate. The article even mentioned oversized tulips and enough berries to keep everyone fed. According to Williams, he and his crew stayed in the valley for 3 months, living off of moose, mountain sheep, and vegetables that he and another prospector had planted. It was a man that he identified only as Smith. While they were there, they claimed to have seen an albino moose wandering around, which immediately reminded readers of Captain Scotty's white deer. William also mentioned a pale bear that looked like the one kept at the Beacon Hill Park Zoo in Victoria, which meant he was talking about a Kermode bear. Williams said that the valley sat somewhere past the Layard trading post, tucked into the same general region that Perry had described earlier that year. For anyone following the rumors, it sounded like both men were pointing to the same stretch of mountain. So is it possible that there is such a place as these prospectors described? Well, as it turns out, there are natural hot springs and geothermal activity within the Nahanni Valley. This feature creates pockets of warmer ground or mist that look out of place in the subarctic. This theory does try to explain why early travelers reported steam rising from the valley in the winter. Another theory suggests that steep canyon walls in the South Nahanni River trap heat, block wind, and create sheltered microclimate. This could make the valley feel warmer than the surrounding tundra, and prospectors could have exaggerated this into a tropical paradise. And then, of course, we could chalk things up to optical illusions and winter atmospheric effects. Cold weather mirages, like Superior mirages or Fata Morgana, can make distant valleys appear lush, green, or misty. prospectors traveling in brutal winter conditions may have interpreted these illusions as signs of a warm, hidden valley. There are some Indigenous stories that describe a spiritually significant or unusual places within the mountain. Prospectors often misunderstood or sensationalized these accounts. A sacred or symbolic warm place could easily become a literal tropical valley in retellings, and claims of a warm valley could attract investors, partners, and attention. Some stories were likely embellished by the prospectors to make expeditions sound more promising or dramatic. Rumors of the valley didn't stop in the 1920s. In 1947, a journalist named Pierre Berton led a winter expedition to find the rumored secret tropical paradise in the Nahanni. His syndicate reports amplified the legend dramatically. The media spectacle helped cement the warm valley myth into Canadian folklore. So realistically, was there ever really a warm valley? The answer is not in the tropical sense. The Nahanni region does have geothermal features, sheltered microclimates, dramatic atmospheric illusions, and a long history of sensationalized prospecting tales. Put all that together, and you've got a legend that feels just plausible enough to survive for over a century. Hearing these stories stack up the way they did, it's hard not to picture the North as a place that just kept slipping out of people's hands the moment they thought they understood it. What stands out about their accounts isn't just the details that they gave, it's the way that each man seemed convinced he'd brushed up against something that the maps hadn't accounted for, something that didn't care about the rules everyone else lives by. And whether they exaggerated, misread what they saw, or stumbled onto something no one else has ever managed to find again, the effect was the same. The North keeps its secrets, and every so often, it lets someone close enough to feel the heat of whatever waits out there, just long enough to make them wonder if they should have kept walking. Thanks for joining me on this eerie journey through Canada's darker corners. If you love this episode of Canadian Creepies, be sure to follow Valerie on Instagram and TikTok at Radio Valerie, and on Instagram at Canadian Creepies. She's the one behind the socials, sharing behind-the-scenes stories, creepy photos, and sneak peeks of upcoming episodes. And if you're craving even more haunted history and twisted folklore, check out my other podcast, Down the Crooked Path. You can follow that show on Instagram and TikTok for even more haunted history, mythical madness, and spine-tingling storytelling. Come say hi, share your own creepy encounters, and help us keep the weird alive. You can take the journey even further by joining the Canadian Creepies Patreon, where you can get exclusive stories, behind-the-scenes footage, and creepy encounters. Until next time, stay curious and stay creepy.